Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and first, a quick note for everybody who's watching this on YouTube or Spotify video. You'll notice the layout is a little bit different. Unfortunately, we had some tech issues with the recording of this episode, so we're running a slightly different setup for this app. Hopefully, we'll be back to normal next week. But the content itself is, as always, a very important conversation this week about the impact and the consequences of Israeli President Isaac Herzog's visit to Australia. To unpack it all, I'm joined by Crikey's legal correspondent and lawyer, Michael Bradley, who is the managing partner of Mark Lawyers. Michael, this is your first time on the Crikey podcast, so welcome and thanks for giving me some time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a pretty meaty topic that we're going to get into and a lot to discuss. So I'm just going to get right into it. Let's get everybody on the same page. By the time you're all listening to watching this episode, Herzog will have left Australia. He was in the country from the 8th to the 12th of February, formally invited by the Governor-General Sam Mostyn on behalf of the government to visit as a comfort to the Jewish community who are still reeling from the Bondi Beach terrorist attack. But it was very clear from the outset that there was also real anger from people, including Jewish people, that the Australian government would host someone who was presiding over a genocide in Gaza. And throughout his visit, we've seen protests right across the country, including those very alarming scenes from Sydney, which we will talk about shortly. But first, Michael, I want to start by talking about Herzog himself and get kind of an understanding of his position. Something that I have heard repeated a lot as part of the objection to, him and his visit is that Herzog is a war criminal or that he is under investigation by the International Criminal Court for his involvement in war crimes. Now, you wrote a piece for Crikey before his arrival about the tension between this moral argument against him and the legal obligations that we have to treat someone like him within Australia. I've linked that in the description to this episode. Maybe you can explain for us first what Herzog is actually facing, if anything, for his involvement in Israel's genocide.
Yeah, so it's not true to say that he is a war criminal in the sense that he's convicted of any war crimes. That hasn't happened. And he's not currently under indictment. Unlike Netanyahu, for example, who is a fugitive, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for him because he has been charged with committing war crimes. Herzog has come across has sort of been involved or implicated via proceedings in the International Court of Justice, which is a different court to the criminal court. It doesn't prosecute crimes. But in South Africa's case against Israel, where it is alleging that Israel is committing genocide, the ICJ has made preliminary findings and issued some rulings in relation to Israel's actions. It has found a prima facie case of that there is a genocide being perpetrated, and it cited comments made by Herzog very early in the piece, not long after October 7, where he made comments to the effect that there were no innocent civilians in Gaza. And it cited that as part of the evidence, there was an incitement of genocide potentially happening. Those comments were also picked up by a UN-appointed commission of inquiry into Gaza, and that commission reported a finding that, in its view, Herzog's comments did amount to an incitement to commit genocide. That's not a legal finding. It doesn't have any force of law. It was in a report. Certainly, incitement to commit genocide is a crime. It's a crime under Australian law. And there's been talk about, the federal police should have arrested Herzog when he arrived and charged him under Australian law or handed him over to the criminal court, etc. None of that was ever going to happen. There is a case. There's a case that could be argued based on Herzog's words, actions, and position that he has some legal liability or culpability for Israel's actions, whether that's war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even genocide. But no court of competent jurisdiction has dealt with any of that. So as matters stand, he's not an indicted or convicted war criminal.
And I imagine the situation would be very different if this visit was by, I mean, for example, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, for investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity. So if it was someone like that, we would be having a really different discussion about what the obligations would be.
Well, Australia has direct obligations under the ICC treaty. It would be obliged to arrest Netanyahu if he set foot on our shores. And if it didn't, it would be in breach of its international legal obligations. So yes, that would be a very vibrant conflict.
Yeah. I'm sure, that was not a small part of the reason why the invitation went to someone like Herzog instead. But, to put that legal obligation to the side for a moment, I think for me, there's a really interesting picture around the moral question for Herzog particularly, and having him here, that came on Wednesday, which is the day that we're recording this episode, when it was reported that Israel was expanding or strengthening its settlements in the West Bank, which is something that has been confirmed as illegal under international law. Now, Israel said the intention for doing so is to kill the idea of a Palestinian state, which is in direct opposition to the Australian government's kind of preferred position on this, which is for a two-state solution. And so we had this quite awkward moment where we have the Department of Foreign Affairs putting out a statement saying we condemn Israel's decision to do this, to strengthen and expand these settlements, on the very same day that Herzog was being hosted at Parliament House in Canberra.
Yeah, look, it points up the conflict in our government's position, because whatever you think of Herzog and his actions personally, he is the head of state of Israel, and Israel, from an international law perspective, is a rogue state. Its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is illegal, has been declared illegal multiple times by the UN. The ICJ issued a ruling a year ago declaring its occupation of Gaza illegal. That's before you get to any questions of whether it's committing genocide or war crimes. But we can all see the evidence of our own eyes as to what it's been doing since October 7 in Gaza, and what it's doing in the West Bank, and has been ramping up in the West Bank in terms of illegal settlements and further dispossession of Palestinian people, and it's sort of what many people describe as apartheid policies. Ismail Herzog is the head of state and is properly answerable for what the state of Israel does. So our government chose to put itself in the position where it made him an invited guest in a context that was already what it was. The fact that it's coincidental that Israel has decided to further double down on its movements in the West Bank while he's here, but that just that's just tough luck for our government. And yes, the contrast between the official position, we disapprove of all of that activity, and we continue to argue for a two-state solution that will never happen, while parading this guy around the country like he's Nelson Mandela. The optics are pretty stunning, and the politics I do not understand.
I mean, yeah, not to mention also that a two-state solution has been Labor's position for a long time also, even setting aside the fact that it's currently a Labor government. I'm sure that there are more than a few within the party who are having these same sort of quite conflicted conversations that we're having about all this right now.
Well, presumably. I mean, one would like to think that Albanese himself is having a very conflicted internal dialogue, given all of the things that he has said through his political life about Palestine and Israel. But yes, the Labor Party's policy position has always been in favour of a two-state solution, always been in favour of Palestinian self-determination, has never been in support of the current Israeli government's stated policies and actions, which are clearly and explicitly designed to eradicate any possibility of Palestinian self-determination or independence ever. How he is squaring that circle for himself, do not know.
I think we may never know what that internal turmoil is like. That's going to be one of the great political mysteries of our time, I feel. But let's talk about the protests in Sydney. As I'm sure everybody listening and watching knows, the protest against Herzog on Monday, the 9th of February, saw a very heavy police presence and some quite shocking escalation to violence, much of which was caught on camera. Now, as part of the discussion that followed this, sort of like the public discourse that followed this, I saw quite wide circulation of this, I think, like a misconception, an idea that the protest was quote unquote illegal. It seemed to stem from kind of like a misunderstanding of the legal challenge of police powers that was raised by the protest organizers and heard in court on the same day of the rally. I think it was ruled on just hours before the actual rally took place. So, Michael, maybe you could just clear that up for everyone. What actually happened here, and how should we understand that legal challenge and legal process on that day?
Yeah, look, nobody should feel ashamed for being completely confused about the state of New South Wales protest laws, because I guarantee you the government doesn't understand them and the Supreme Court is struggling to keep up. There are multiple layers to this. To start with, New South Wales has the most repressive anti-protest laws in the country, and among the most repressive in the democratic world. We have this weird regime under the Summary Offences Act where you can apply for a permit to have a public assembly or march or rally, which, if approved by the police or the Supreme Court, gives the people participating some immunity from offences they may otherwise commit because of those very repressive laws that, for example, make it illegal to block traffic or pedestrian flow in a public space, which is basically anywhere, like Town Hall Square. So that all that does is just give you some immunity. It doesn't authorise, it doesn't make the protest itself legal or illegal. There's no law that says protest activity or public assembly is illegal. X. Then you've got these crazy laws they passed just before Christmas. This power they've given the police commissioner to declare public assemblies illegal. Again, that just sort of deauthorises people getting together for this kind of things. And the police commissioner made that declaration. That declaration is still in effect in the CBD. So that, again, strips attendees of legal protections and gives extra powers to the police. On top of that, they then decided to declare a major event under a separate piece of legislation for Herzog's visit, which covers most of the CBD, north of Hyde Park, and the whole of the eastern suburbs. This is a law that was designed for major sporting events and major, OPEC, ASEAN meetings, that kind of thing. Anyway, they invoked it for this one. That was what the legal challenge was actually about, and the Supreme Court ruled against the challenge. The effect of that is that it again gives the police more extreme powers, including currently in the CBD and the eastern suburbs, the police have the power to search anyone, which they don't normally have. They can move anyone on from anywhere. They don't have to have a reason. They can shut off areas. They can, they basically have extreme police powers designed to ensure that, there isn't some catastrophic thing that happens because there's lots of people or there's something really, major happening. Anyway, so that's the legal context. It meant that the crowd gathering at Town Hall Square on Monday night were not there illegally. They had the legal right to be there, but they had no protections. The police had expansive powers to interfere with their assembly. And the police, because of the Major Events Declaration, have immunity from civil claims. So the people who got bashed can't sue the police for their injuries.
Right.
Now, I doubt that Constable Bloggs was thinking about that when he was kidney punching an old man, but nor was he thinking about the fact that he might that he didn't have immunity from criminal prosecution for assault. But all of this, radically shifted the balance of rights and responsibilities. And it's pretty clear that the New South Wales Police, either by direction or implicitly from the language that was coming from the government, felt very empowered on Monday night to do whatever they wanted. And they certainly did.
That is another thing that I've sort of seen, another idea I've seen doing the rounds, is that some of those really confronting scenes of what looks, at least by what has been captured, what looks like police escalation, things like, police having someone restrained but repeatedly punching that restrained person, or I'm sure everybody has seen the video footage of police grabbing the Muslim men who are praying and throwing them to the ground, approaching them from behind when they cannot see them, and sort of grabbing them and throwing them to the ground. I've seen this idea that because, again, this mistaken conception of the protest as illegal, that allows and justifies for police to use any level of force that they deem appropriate for the situation. I do just want to point out that at the time we record this, I think New South Wales Police have said 27 arrests were made and they've charged only 9 people. So that's also, I think, interesting in terms of the scenes that we saw, that at this point, at least, only 9 actual charges have been laid. Yeah. What's your assessment on the force and the force that we've seen used? How is that weighed up?
Yeah. Look, in terms of sort of the factual scenario, I approach these things, always sort of try to approach these things skeptically, because, forming judgments based on what you see on social media is a pretty fraught business and definitely not something a lawyer should do. As it happens, 2 of our lawyers were there. And, I spoke to them at length about what they saw and experienced. And they confirmed, certainly to my satisfaction, that what we were seeing is what happened, and and there were a lot of journalists there too who have, including from Crikey, filed really lengthy, detailed reports about what they observed, and they're very consistent. It seems very clear that, the police kettled the crowd. There were conflicting directions and instructions about dispersal, and then they shut off access points that they had sort of been directing the crowds, and they closed them in, and there was unprovoked violence from police. And certainly the people I know who were there said it was a panicked situation. People were extremely distressed, and it was terrifying. And this is in the context of over 2 years now of consistently peaceful pro-Palestinian demonstrations in the city of Sydney every week. So it's not like there wasn't a sort of a track record of these organisers, knowing what they're doing. There'd been a reasonable track record of dealings with the police so something had changed in the atmosphere, and it is very clear that the attitude that the police on the ground brought to that particular protest gathering was qualitatively different from what has been seen before, and what was being seen at the same time in, for example, Melbourne and Brisbane, where similar sized crowds but completely peaceful outcomes. Yeah, and I put it down to the language and tone that was being deployed by the New South Wales government, particularly the Premier, in the lead up to what happened. If they weren't begging for this to happen, there was certainly, they shouldn't have been surprised. And it was interesting to see the New South Wales Police Minister, Catley, the day after, when there were further protests outside the police centre, making a public statement saying to people, literally, please do not antagonise the police. By doing what? Turning up and protesting. Which is a civil right. That's pretty demeaning to the police, as if they're some sort of chained animals who can't be trusted not to use excessive force. But But there's a reality about policing, as we're seeing in the US at the moment with ICE. Police are invested with lethal force and lethal training. They're armed, equipped, and uniformed as figures of a violent authority, if necessary. And if the government licenses them explicitly or implicitly to use excessive violence, they will. History tells us that over and over and over again. There's no point blaming the individual cops. I mean, the ones doing the punching should be prosecuted and kicked out of the force, but nobody should express surprise that that's what they did in the context. Yeah, and that is giving full allowance to the fact that sometimes police have to use violence. Sometimes they have to use violence to preserve peace, and that can be an incredibly difficult and nuanced thing, and cops know this because they live it every day when they're dealing with domestic violence, which is most of what they do. And de-escalation is at the core of their skill set. There was no de-escalation on evidence on Monday night.
And it sounds like most of what is allowed for some of those shocking scenes, and perhaps some of the escalation from police, the cover for that has been provided by the application of the Major Events Act. Is that do I have the correct interpretation of that? Or
look, it doesn't. Those legal mechanisms don't give them the right to engage, to use excessive force or unprovoked violence on peaceful protesters. It doesn't license what appears to have happened from the video footage, where it seems people were just being attacked, and people who were already subdued were being violently assaulted on the ground, or what happened to the men who are engaged in Muslim prayers. I think that the relevance of these legal maneuvers and mechanisms is that they, by their invocation, have increased the temperature. They were provocative acts, and the government used these tools to preempt what it claimed was going to happen without evidence. And the New South Wales government, from the Premier down, has a lot of questions to answer about what on earth were they thinking. Yes, of course, there was always going to be very, very strong protest against Herzog's presence. That was clear. That, but where did the idea come that it was going to be violent? From what? I mean, Herzog's presence isn't more of a provocation than what Israel's been doing in Gaza for 2 years to the people who are protesting it. What was qualitatively different about, what was going to be different about this, unless you're drawing a direct line to Bondi. And I think that, to me, that's a big part of the problem, that the government is insisting on drawing a direct and brutally simplistic line from pro-Palestinian activism and protest and anti-Israel protest to the terrorist attack at Bondi. And that's simply unevidenced, if I could put it in a polite way.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it is. It did form an explicit part of the reason for, inviting Herzog in the first place. I think, as I mentioned in the intro, the government said that the purpose of this visit, of extending the invitation, was to bring comfort to a community in mourning, the Jewish community, of course. And certainly it does seem like one part of the Jewish community in Australia did ask for this visit. But another part of that community has been repeatedly warning about the dangers of conflating Israel and Jewish identity as one and the same. Anybody who's been following this issue in the news, anyone who's been reading or listening or watching Crikey over the past couple of years will well know that support or opposition of Israel is one of the most contentious arguments within the Jewish community itself. So I did think it was quite extraordinary that Anthony Albanese made some comments where he said that Isaac Herzog is the head of state for Australian Jews. I mean, it seems like extraordinary framing to me. But if I take all of that in everything that you've just said, Michael, if the goal is to comfort the Jewish community with this visit, and if the goal of the Albanese government after the Bondi attacks is to turn the temperature down, to bring people together, to have this unity as they keep sort of saying and repeating, can we say that the Herzog visit helped those aims, or has it hurt those aims?
Look, I don't think anyone can seriously say that Herzog's visit has helped. If the aim was to, bring unity, as Albanese said, or to bring the temperature down, well, of course it hasn't. It's been a disaster for, in terms of, compounding the divisions and the anger in our community, our society. It's been absolutely disastrous, and it was always going to be. The more our state and federal governments demand that we all just shut up, as if that's going to create their mythical social cohesion, of course, the angrier people get. This disconnect between what the political class and what large part of the media class are demanding, that we all just kind of fall into line and pretend that the only context to this visit is Bondi and the connection between Australian Jews and Israel, and ignore everything else that has been happening in the past more than 2 years, is so insulting and offensive, not just to Palestinian Australians, but to all Australians. Because we can, we're intelligent enough to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. We can deplore Bondi while deploring Gaza. And we can say, we do not actually want the head of state of the country that is doing that here, now. Now, I think Albanese's statement calling Herzog the head of state of Australian Jews is very telling. Because, obviously it's wrong. Australian Jews are Australians, and the head of state is the king, unlike the rest of us. But it also speaks to the mindset that I think, Albanese has kind of fallen into, and certainly, Minns and a lot of, and seemingly, a large part of the Labor Party, this identification, this, it's kind of universal identification of Jewish people with the existence of the state of Israel as a unitary identity, which is the point that the pro-Israel lobby has been, and Israel itself has been pushing for decades, that you cannot criticize Israel without criticizing Jews, that you cannot attack Israel without attacking Jewish identity, because Israel is Jewish identity. And what Herzog's visit, I think, and everything around it has kind of crystallized, is how that notion cannot coexist with this kind of, social cohesion that everyone keeps talking about. You can't have two heads of your own state, like you're Australian or you're Israeli, at a very brutally simple level. You can feel an emotional attachment or some attachment of loyalty or fealty to another country. You can feel very attached to Israel if you're an Australian Jew. It does not make the president of Israel your head of state, and it does not create an obligation of allegiance that outranks your allegiance to the country of which you're a citizen. And everybody in Australia does not owe some overarching obligation to not say mean things about Israel because it upsets Australian Jews. We're a long way down that path now. Much of what all of our governments have been doing have been playing directly into that narrative. It is not helping social cohesion. It is driving division. It is creating increasing anger. And if you want reasons for Bondi, and the Royal Commission is going to look seriously at what happened there. Why did it happen? That is part of the picture that is going to have to be explored. If the government is serious about not wanting people bringing their foreign entanglements here, then it has to accept that cuts both ways. Yes, what is happening in Gaza is not our war, but the Israeli project, what it is actually doing on the ground day by day in Gaza and the West Bank, that is not ours either.
Mm.
But yeah, to come back to the starting point, yeah, do we all feel happier than we did a couple of days ago when Herzog arrived? Nobody does.
Yes, the first couple of months of this year have felt like it really, or a couple of months of this year. It's only really been a month and a half, so I mean, I think that goes some way to indicate how I've felt about the start of this year. But yeah, it just feels like the tensions keep rising as much as they continually try to say we have to take the tensions down. I'm not sure who it was that said everybody needs to chill. I do think it was interesting that at some point this week, Tanya Plibersek mentioned that the government was well aware that there were going to be tensions and there was going to be security issues and all of these things around this visit. It really makes you question why the decisions were made and ultimately what the landscape is going to look after Herzog goes and long after he's left.
You don't have to be in either of those communities to understand how hot that must feel and how heightened those emotions are. In inviting Herzog here, the federal government either thought, yeah, let's light a match, or it didn't think at all. I assume it's the latter. It speaks to incredibly poor understanding and judgment of the situation. But you cannot, on one hand, be saying, everybody chill, let's take the temperature down, this isn't doing any good for anyone, and then bring a lightning rod into the middle of the room, and then it gets hit by lightning, and you're like, oh, gee, didn't see that coming. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely. Just bring the emblem of the core of the conflict right into the middle of it. Well, yeah, Michael, very much value your expertise in helping me kind of unpack some of the the many misconceptions around this and such to have these discussions, I think, at such a tense time, have a place for them is really important. So thanks for giving me your time on this today.
Absolute pleasure. Good chat.
If you enjoyed this episode of Cut Through, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review for the podcast. Crikey is 100% independent, which means your support powers our journalism.